In the smoke-choked valleys of Millbrook County, Pennsylvania, where coal dust settles like black snow on everything it touches, desperation has a way of turning decent people into commodities. The year is 1885, and the courthouse steps have become a marketplace for human misery, where those crushed by debt are sold to the highest bidder like livestock at market. Isabella Carter sits rigid in the back row of wooden chairs, her worn gloves clutching the last $3 to her name, watching as her neighbors are auctioned off one by one to pay their creditors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air bites through her threadbare coat as she witnesses the systematic dismantling of lives she has known since childhood. William Morris, the blacksmith who once shod her father's horses, goes for $12 to a mine foreman who needs strong arms for dangerous work. Sarah Jenkins, whose bakery fed half the town during better times, is purchased by a wealthy widow who requires a cook and housekeeper. Each sale is announced with the cold efficiency of livestock trading, reducing human beings to their labor value and nothing more. But when they drag forth Lot 15, the entire crowd falls into an uneasy silence that seems to press against Isabella's chest like a physical weight. The man they escort onto the platform is enormous, standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His head is completely covered by a black cloth hood tied with rough rope, and his massive hands are bound behind his back with iron shackles that seem insufficient for containing such obvious power. Even the auctioneer, a portly man named Garrett, who has been conducting these sales for months, appears nervous as he approaches the podium. The whispers begin immediately, rippling through the assembled crowd like wind through dry leaves. They say he strangled a man with his bare hands down in Pittsburgh, beat 3 police officers unconscious when they tried to arrest him. Some claim he doesn't speak at all, that whatever broke inside his mind during the war left him more animal than man. Others insist he's cursed, that violence follows him like a shadow, and anyone foolish enough to buy his labor will regret it before the week is out. Isabella finds herself staring at this hooded giant, something stirring in her memory that she cannot quite place. There is something familiar about the way he holds himself, the careful control in his posture despite the restraints, as if he is constantly monitoring his own strength to ensure it causes no unintended harm. When a child in the crowd begins to cry, startled by his intimidating presence, she notices how his hooded head turns slightly toward the sound, not with menace but with what might be concern. The bidding opens at $10, but the silence stretches on like a prayer no one wants to answer. Garrett's voice climbs with increasing desperation as he tries to entice buyers with descriptions of the man's obvious physical capabilities. But the crowd seems frozen by collective fear. This is not mere reluctance to spend money, but genuine terror of whatever reputation has preceded this silent figure onto their courthouse steps. As the price drops to $5, then $3, Isabella feels something twist in her chest that she recognizes as the same compassion that has always been both her greatest strength and most dangerous weakness. She thinks of her own desperate circumstances, of the failing inn that has been her family's legacy for 3 generations, of the mounting debts that will soon force her into circumstances not unlike those faced by the people being sold today. But more than that, she thinks of the fundamental wrongness of treating human beings like livestock, regardless of what crimes they may have committed or what fears they may inspire. When Garrett's voice cracks with desperation as he announces the final call for $3, Isabella's hand rises seemingly of its own accord, her voice carrying across the silent crowd with startling clarity. The word here emerges from her lips before her rational mind can intervene, sealing a decision that will transform her understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the complicated mathematics of human redemption. The crowd turns to stare at her with expressions ranging from shock to pity, their faces reflecting the universal belief that poor Isabella Carter has finally succumbed to the pressures that have been crushing her spirit for months. The transaction is completed with bureaucratic efficiency that makes her stomach turn. Papers are signed, money changes hands, and suddenly she finds herself responsible for a man whose very presence seems to alter the atmosphere around him. The shackles are removed with obvious reluctance, and she watches as he flexes his massive hands, working circulation back into fingers that bear old scars across the knuckles. When he moves, it is with deliberate care, as if every gesture must be calculated to avoid causing alarm or injury to those around him. The wagon ride back to Carter's Rest Inn passes in silence, so complete that Isabella becomes acutely aware of every creak of the wheels, every clip of her horse's hooves on the packed dirt road. Her passenger sits motionless in the wagon bed, his hooded head turning occasionally to observe their surroundings with what seems like professional assessment rather than casual interest. She finds herself stealing glances at his massive frame, trying to reconcile the gentle restraint she observes with the terrifying reputation that has preceded him into her life. Carter's Rest Inn sits on 5 acres of land that once represented prosperity and promise, but now serves mainly as a monument to dreams deferred by circumstances beyond her control. The 3-story building that her grandfather constructed with his own hands shows signs of neglect that she cannot afford to address, its paint peeling and shutters hanging askew like broken wings. The stable that once housed a dozen horses now shelters only her aging mare, and the gardens that her grandmother tended with such pride have surrendered to weeds and indifference. When they arrive at the property, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Isabella helps her silent passenger down from the wagon, surprised by the gentleness with which he moves despite his intimidating size. She shows him to the small room behind the kitchen that has served as quarters for hired help during the inn's more prosperous days. The space is modest but clean, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair that looks comically small compared to his massive frame. He examines the accommodations with apparent satisfaction, nodding his acceptance in a way that suggests gratitude rather than resignation. The list of tasks requiring attention is overwhelming. The inn's foundation needs repair where winter frost has shifted the stones. The roof leaks in 3 places, allowing rain to damage the upper rooms that once housed paying guests. The well pump has been making ominous grinding sounds that suggest mechanical failure is imminent. The vegetable garden lies fallow, its soil compacted and neglected since her father's death 18 months ago. Each problem represents an expense she cannot afford, yet ignoring them will only accelerate the property's decline toward complete worthlessness. As evening approaches, Isabella prepares a simple meal of bread, cheese, and preserved meat, setting 2 places at the kitchen table before catching herself. The social conventions governing her relationship with this man remain unclear, complicated by the unusual circumstances of his presence and the fear that seems to surround his reputation. She solves the dilemma by carrying his portion to his room along with a cup of cider made from apples that still grow wild on the property's edges. She finds him sitting on the edge of the bed, his massive frame making the furniture appear dollhouse-sized, his hooded head bowed in what might be prayer or simply exhaustion. When she sets the tray on the small table beside his chair, he looks up with what she senses is surprise, as if kindness is not something he has learned to expect from those who hold power over his circumstances. His thanks come in the form of a slight bow, a gesture so formal and courteous that it seems to belong to another time and place entirely. The first few days establish a routine that feels both natural and surreal. Isabella wakes before dawn to prepare breakfast, leaving his portion on the kitchen table before beginning her own work maintaining the property. By the time she returns from feeding the chickens and checking the modest vegetable garden, she invariably finds that he has completed tasks she had not even mentioned needing attention. Loose boards on the front porch are mysteriously secured. The stable door that has been sticking for months suddenly swings smoothly on its hinges. The pile of firewood behind the kitchen grows steadily larger despite her not seeing him split logs. His approach to work is methodical and thorough, addressing not just immediate problems but underlying issues that would cause future difficulties. When he repairs the loose stones in the foundation, he takes time to ensure proper drainage that will prevent future frost damage. His attention to the roof goes beyond simple patching to include reinforcing supports that have been weakened by years of weather exposure. Every task is completed with a level of craftsmanship that speaks to extensive experience and genuine pride in quality work. What strikes her most profoundly is his relationship with the property's animals. Her aging mare, who has grown skittish and difficult since her father's death, follows him around the pasture like a devoted companion. The barn cats, who typically flee at the approach of strangers, wind around his legs while he works, apparently sensing no threat from his imposing presence. Even the chickens, normally nervous creatures that scatter at unexpected movement, continue pecking contentedly when he passes through their yard. The change in her daily life is remarkable. Tasks that have seemed overwhelming when faced alone become manageable when shared, even silently, with someone whose competence matches his obvious strength. The constant anxiety about maintaining the property begins to ease as systems that have been failing for months are restored to proper function. For the first time since her father's death, Isabella allows herself to imagine that Carter's Rest Inn might survive the economic pressures that have been threatening its existence. But it is during the evening hours that she begins to understand the depth of whatever trauma has shaped this man's current circumstances. The nightmares begin on his third night, sounds of distress that carry across the yard from his small room behind the kitchen. Not quite screams, but deep groans of anguish that speak to suffering beyond anything she has personally experienced. The first time it happens, she lies in her bed listening with a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty about whether intervention would be welcome or appropriate. By the fourth night, concern overcomes social convention, and she makes her way across the dark yard carrying a lamp and a cup of warm milk sweetened with honey. She finds him sitting on the edge of his bed, his massive frame trembling with exhaustion, and whatever demons have visited him in sleep. The black hood remains in place, concealing his features, but his posture speaks eloquently of someone struggling to distinguish nightmare from reality. "Are you all right?" she asks softly, not wanting to startle him if he is still caught between sleeping and waking. His response is barely audible, a single word spoken in a voice hoarse with exhaustion, and something that might be shame. "Sorry." The apology carries such weight of regret that it brings tears to her eyes. This assumption that his suffering is somehow an imposition on her peace. "You have nothing to apologize for," she says, setting the lamp on his table and offering the warm milk with hands steady despite the emotional turbulence his distress creates in her chest. "We all carry our ghosts." She settles on the single chair, maintaining respectful distance while providing the comfort of human presence during his struggle to separate dreams from reality. When his breathing finally steadies and the trembling subsides, she returns to her own room with questions that follow her into fitful sleep. The pattern repeats over the following nights, these vigils that become as much a part of their routine as shared meals and collaborative work. She begins to understand that his nightmares follow certain triggers, that the sound of rain on the roof or distant thunder can transport him to battlefields that exist now only in memory and trauma. During these episodes, she provides whatever comfort silence and presence can offer, never pressing for explanations but simply bearing witness to suffering she cannot fully comprehend. It is during one of these midnight visits that she first notices his hands, glimpsed when he reaches for the milk she has brought. Even in the lamplight's uncertain glow, she can see that his fingers bear scars that speak to violence both given and received. But more than that, she notices the care with which he handles the delicate cup, the obvious effort he makes to control strength that could easily crush fragile things. These are not the hands of someone who enjoys violence, but of someone who has learned to be constantly vigilant about the potential for accidental harm. The revelation comes during his second week at the inn, when storm clouds gather with the particular intensity that promises severe weather. The afternoon light takes on that greenish quality that often precedes dangerous wind, and Isabella finds herself checking the shutters and securing anything that might become projectiles in high winds. Her mysterious helper disappears into the barn as the first drops begin to fall, and she assumes he is simply seeking shelter from what promises to be a significant storm. But as the wind picks up and rain begins pelting the windows with increasing force, she hears sounds from the direction of the barn that suggest activity rather than simple shelter seeking. Through the kitchen window, she catches glimpses of movement in the lamplight that flickers through gaps in the weathered boards. The storm intensifies with frightening speed, the kind of sudden squall that can cause serious damage to structures not properly secured. When the wind reaches its peak intensity, she realizes with growing alarm that several of the barn's boards have been loosened by previous storms, creating weak points that could fail catastrophically in these conditions. The thought of her horse trapped inside a collapsing structure drives her out into the storm. Despite the obvious danger, her feet sliding on mud, as she fights against wind that seems determined to knock her flat. What she discovers in the barn stops her cold. Her mysterious helper has somehow managed to reinforce the entire structure from the inside. using materials she had not realized were available to create bracing that will allow the building to withstand forces that would otherwise destroy it. But more than his practical competence, it is his position that takes her breath away. He has placed himself between her horse and the weakest wall, his massive frame serving as a human shield against potential collapse. "You could be killed," she shouts over the storm's roar, trying to make him understand the unnecessary risk he is taking for the sake of an animal that, while precious to her, surely cannot matter enough to him to justify such danger. His response comes not in words but in a gesture toward the terrified mare, whose eyes are wide with storm fear, but who stands calm in his protective presence. He will not move, she realizes, will not abandon his post regardless of personal risk, because something in his nature compels him to stand between danger and innocence. The storm passes as suddenly as it arrived, leaving behind the particular stillness that follows natural violence. Together they assess the property for damage, finding that his preparations have prevented what could have been catastrophic destruction. Trees have fallen across the road leading to town, but the inn itself has suffered only minor damage that can be easily repaired. More importantly, no one has been hurt, thanks entirely to his foresight and willingness to sacrifice his own safety for the protection of others. As they work together to clear debris and restore normal function to systems disrupted by the storm, Isabella finds herself studying this man who has appeared in her life, like an answer to prayers she had not realized she was praying. His competence extends far beyond simple manual labor to encompass knowledge of construction, mechanics, and animal husbandry that suggests either extensive training or years of practical experience. Yet he moves through these tasks with the quiet humility of someone who expects no recognition for his contributions. The question of his identity begins to consume her thoughts during the long hours when he works in stoic silence, his hooded head turning occasionally in her direction as if sensing her curiosity. She finds herself inventing explanations for his presence, stories that might account for both his obvious skills and the fearsome reputation that preceded him to the auction. Perhaps he is a veteran, whose war experiences have left him unable to function in normal society. Maybe he is a skilled craftsman whose business failed during the economic troubles that have affected so many. Each possibility raises new questions about what sequence of events could reduce such a capable man to the status of human commodity. The turning point comes during his third week at the inn, when Sheriff Bennett arrives for what he describes as a routine welfare check, but which feels more like an interrogation designed to confirm his suspicions about the dangerous individual Isabella has welcomed into her home. The sheriff's bearing suggests official concern, mixed with personal disapproval of her judgment, his questions carefully designed to elicit admissions that might justify more aggressive intervention. "Has he shown any signs of violence?" Bennett asks, his eyes constantly scanning the property, as if expecting to discover evidence of threat or wrongdoing. "Any behavior that might cause you concern about your safety?" The questions rankle Isabella with their assumption that she lacks the judgment to recognize genuine danger, their implication that her kindness has blinded her to obvious risks. "Quite the opposite," she replies firmly, gesturing toward the repairs and improvements that have transformed her struggling property into something approaching its former functionality. "He has been nothing but helpful and courteous, and I have never felt safer in my home." The sheriff's skepticism is evident in his expression, his obvious belief that her positive assessment stems from naivety rather than accurate observation. "Miss Carter," Bennett says, his voice taking on the patronizing tone men often use when they believe women require guidance in matters beyond their comprehension. "You need to understand that this man's reputation for violence is not based on rumors or speculation. There are documented incidents, official reports that paint a picture of someone who solves problems with his fists rather than words." The conversation is interrupted by the appearance of the man in question, who emerges from behind the inn, carrying tools and moving with the deliberate care that has characterized all his interactions since his arrival. Even Bennett, despite his official authority and armed status, takes an involuntary step backward when confronted with the reality of this imposing figure's physical presence. The black hood conceals facial expressions, but his posture suggests awareness of the tension and concern about being the cause of difficulty for his benefactor. "There's been no trouble here," Isabella says, moving to stand beside her mysterious helper in a gesture of solidarity that is not lost on the watching sheriff. "This man has worked harder and with more dedication than any hired hand I have ever employed. And he has never given me cause for concern." Her defense seems to surprise Bennett, who clearly expected to find a frightened woman grateful for official intervention, rather than someone willing to challenge law enforcement's assessment of the situation. After the sheriff's departure, Isabella finds herself alone with questions that have been building since that first day at the auction. The official warnings about violence and danger seem impossible to reconcile with the gentle soul who tends her animals and repairs her property with such obvious care. Either the authorities are wrong about his character, or there is more to his story than the simple narrative of criminality they have constructed around his reputation. The answer begins to emerge through the accumulation of small observations and telling details that build toward unavoidable conclusions about the true nature of the man she has welcomed into her home. His knowledge of construction techniques speaks to professional training or extensive experience in skilled trades. His way with animals suggests someone who has spent significant time working with livestock or perhaps horses. Most tellingly, his response to every crisis or challenge demonstrates not just competence but leadership instincts that seem inconsistent with the criminal background his reputation suggests. The breakthrough comes when she discovers a small wooden cross among his few possessions, carved with obvious skill and worn smooth by countless hands. The craftsmanship speaks to hours of careful work, but more than that, the religious symbolism suggests someone whose moral compass has been shaped by values that would seem to preclude the violent criminality he is accused of embracing. When she mentions finding it, his reaction is immediate and profound, a stillness that suggests the object carries deep personal significance beyond mere decoration or casual faith. It is then that he begins to communicate through gestures and expressions that gradually tell a story of service, sacrifice, and circumstances that led to choices no one should have to make. The violence in his past was not the random brutality of a dangerous criminal, but the targeted intervention of someone who appeared when innocence was threatened and evil seemed triumphant. Each gesture adds another piece to a puzzle that reveals not a villain, but a hero whose heroism has cost him everything society typically offers as reward for virtue. The full truth emerges slowly, through patient observation and the gradual trust that allows him to share pieces of a story too complex for simple moral categories. This is a man who has spent years appearing when hope was lost, intervening when no one else would act, protecting those who could not protect themselves. The reputation for violence that preceded him to the auction block was earned through choices that prioritized the safety of innocents over his own welfare. Decisions that marked him as dangerous only to those who threatened others. As Isabella's understanding of his true nature deepens, so does her appreciation for the magnitude of what he has sacrificed in service to principles larger than personal comfort or safety. The silence that has marked their relationship is not the result of intellectual limitation or social dysfunction, but the disciplined quiet of someone who has learned that words often complicate situations better resolved through action. His hooded concealment speaks not to shame about his appearance, but to awareness that his presence often frightens those he seeks to protect. The recognition that has been building since that first day at the auction finally crystallizes into certainty about what fate has delivered to her door. This is not simply a strong back and willing hands purchased for $3 at a desperate auction. This is a guardian whose path has intersected with hers at a moment when both their lives hung in the balance, when her need for protection coincided with his need for sanctuary. The transaction that began as an impulse of compassion has evolved into something approaching destiny, a connection that transcends the economics of labor and debt to touch the deeper mathematics of human souls recognizing their intended companions. Part 2. The mysterious recognition moment. The morning fog clung to the valley like secrets refusing to be revealed when Isabella discovered the carved wooden horse sitting on her kitchen windowsill. The craftsmanship was exquisite,
every line and curve shaped with the kind of patience that spoke to hours of careful work, its surface polished to a warm glow that caught the early light filtering through the glass. She had never seen it before, yet something about its presence felt both mysterious and deeply familiar, as if it carried memories just beyond the reach of conscious thought. She found Marcus already at work in the vegetable garden, his massive frame bent over rows of earth that had lain fallow since her father's death. The black hood concealed his features as always, but his movements held a careful precision that transformed the neglected soil into neat furrows ready for planting. When she approached with the wooden horse cradled in her palms, his entire body went still in a way that suggested the small carving carried significance far beyond its simple beauty. "Did you make this?" she asked, holding the horse toward him with hands that trembled slightly despite her effort to maintain composure. His response was barely perceptible, the slightest inclination of his hooded head that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and something that might have been vulnerability. The admission seemed to cost him something, as if revealing even this small aspect of his hidden nature required courage he had been carefully conserving. The horse was not just beautifully carved but bore details that spoke to intimate knowledge of the animal it represented. The arch of the neck, the positioning of the legs, the expression captured in the wooden features all suggested someone who had spent considerable time observing and understanding horses not as mere tools of labor but as individual creatures worthy of artistic tribute. When she traced the smooth lines with her fingertip, she noticed tiny initials carved into the base so small they were almost invisible. "MS," she read aloud, looking up to find his attention focused on her with an intensity that seemed to burn through the concealing fabric of his hood. "Marcus Sullivan." The name emerged from her lips before her conscious mind could process where the knowledge had come from, the sounds feeling familiar on her tongue, in a way that sent chills racing down her spine despite the morning's growing warmth. His reaction was immediate and profound. The garden tools slipped from his hands as his massive frame straightened to its full intimidating height, and she could sense his shock radiating outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The hooded head turned toward her with such sudden focus that she instinctively took a step backward, not from fear but from the overwhelming intensity of recognition that seemed to crackle in the air between them. "How do you know that name?" The words came in a voice like distant thunder, deep and resonant and filled with emotions too complex to easily categorize. This was the first time she had heard him speak more than the single syllable of apology that had marked their previous interactions. And
The sound of his voice triggered something in her memory that made her heart race with anticipation. She could not explain. The memory surfaced slowly, like something precious rising from deep water. A little girl's voice calling out across a dusty courtyard, her small hands reaching toward a tall figure who had appeared during the darkest moment of her young life. The same voice, deeper now but unmistakably familiar, responding with gentle patience to questions and fears that had seemed overwhelming to someone barely old enough to understand the magnitude of what she had lost. "Marcus," she whispered, the name carrying the weight of 15 years and 1,000 dreams about the mysterious savior who had vanished from her life as suddenly as he had appeared. "Marcus Sullivan from the Pittsburgh Children's Home. You were the stable master who taught me to ride when I was 12 years old, after my parents died in the typhoid outbreak." The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge spanning decades of separation and misunderstanding. She watched as his massive hands began to tremble, watched as the careful control he maintained over his physical presence threatened to crumble under the weight of memories that had clearly shaped both their lives in ways neither had fully understood until this moment. Pittsburgh Children's Home had been a place of last resort for orphans whose relatives could not or would not claim them. A grim institution where survival often depended more on luck than justice. Isabella had arrived there at 12, her world shattered by disease that had swept through their neighborhood like a biblical plague, leaving her alone and terrified in a system designed more for convenience than compassion. The home had been overcrowded, understaffed, and managed by people who viewed their charges as burdens rather than children deserving care and protection. It was Marcus who had made her survival possible, though she had not understood at the time the full extent of what he had done on her behalf. As stable master, He had possessed one of the few positions at the institution that came with both respect and relative independence. Authority that he had used consistently to protect the most vulnerable children from predators both inside and outside the official structure. He had taught her to ride on an old mare named Duchess, patient lessons that had nothing to do with his official duties and everything to do with recognizing a broken child who needed reasons to hope for better days ahead. Under his guidance, she had learned not just the mechanics of horsemanship, but the deeper lessons of trust, responsibility, and the kind of gentle strength that could coax cooperation from creatures far larger and more powerful than herself. More than riding instruction, he had provided sanctuary during the worst periods of institutional life. When older children turned cruel, when staff members proved indifferent to obvious injustice, when the weight of being unwanted threatened to crush her spirit entirely, Marcus had somehow always appeared with tasks that needed completion in the stables, work that happened to require her specific assistance and coincidentally removed her from dangerous situations. His protection had extended beyond simple physical safety to include the preservation of hope itself. He had told her stories during the long hours they spent caring for the horses, tales of children who had escaped poverty and abandonment to build meaningful lives, adventures that always ended with good triumphing over adversity and virtue being rewarded with happiness. At the time, she had assumed these were simply entertaining fiction designed to pass time during routine work. Now, looking into his concealed face and feeling the weight of recognition that connected past and present, she began to understand that those stories had been carefully chosen therapy, narratives designed to plant seeds of possibility in ground that had been scorched by loss and disappointment. Every tale had featured protagonists who faced circumstances similar to her own, heroes whose courage and persistence eventually led them to the kind of life she had barely dared to imagine for herself. The wooden horse in her hands suddenly acquired new meaning as she remembered similar carvings that had appeared in her small dormitory room during her time at the children's home. She had assumed they came from one of the other orphans, small gifts exchanged among children who had little to share but who understood the comfort that could come from handmade tokens of friendship. The realization that Marcus had been their creator, that he had spent his evening hours crafting these beautiful objects for children who had been abandoned by everyone else, brought tears to her eyes that she did not attempt to hide. "You disappeared," she said, her voice thick with emotions that had been buried for 15 years but now surged forward with devastating clarity. "One morning I came to the stables for our usual lesson, and you were gone. No explanation, no goodbye, no word about where you had gone or why you left." His massive frame seemed to deflate slightly, the careful posture he maintained giving way to something that might have been shame or regret. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions that had clearly haunted him for years. "There was trouble, accusations that threatened not just me but everyone I had tried to protect. I left to draw the danger away from the children." The explanation opened floodgates of memory that had been sealed by time and the self-protective amnesia that sometimes mercifully obscures childhood trauma. She remembered now the whispered conversations among staff members, the sudden appearance of official investigators, the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had settled over the institution like a toxic cloud. Several children had reported inappropriate behavior by one of the administrators, allegations that had threatened to expose systematic abuse that had been carefully hidden from outside scrutiny. Marcus had been the one adult in the institution who had consistently advocated for the children's welfare, the only staff member whose loyalty clearly lay with his charges rather than with the power structure that employed him. When the investigation had begun to threaten those responsible for the abuse, he had become a natural target for retaliation, accused of misconduct designed to discredit his testimony and remove him as a protective presence. "They said you had been inappropriate with some of the children," she remembered aloud, understanding now flooding through her with painful clarity. "But we knew it was a lie. You were the only one who kept us safe from the people who were actually hurting us." His nod confirmed what she had suspected even as a 12-year-old child whose understanding of adult politics had been limited but whose instincts about genuine character had proved remarkably accurate. The accusations against Marcus had been fabricated by those whose criminal behavior he had threatened to expose, a deliberate campaign to destroy the credibility of someone whose testimony could have sent powerful people to prison. "I could have fought the charges," he said, his voice carrying the weight of choices that had clearly defined the trajectory of his entire adult life. Could have demanded a trial, could have forced them to prove their lies in court. But while I was fighting for my reputation, who would have protected the children from the real predators? The sacrifice he had made suddenly acquired dimensions that took her breath away. By accepting exile rather than fighting false accusations, he had preserved his ability to continue the protective work that had become his calling, even if it meant abandoning the specific children he had been caring for at the Pittsburgh institution. His reputation had been destroyed, his position eliminated, his name associated with crimes he had never committed, but somewhere other vulnerable children had benefited from his continued vigilance. "Where did you go?" she asked, though part of her suspected the answer would reveal a pattern of service that had defined his entire adult existence. "What happened after you left Pittsburgh?" His response came through gestures that gradually painted a picture of 15 years spent moving from place to place, appearing wherever protection was needed, and disappearing before relationships could form, or questions could be asked too deeply. Orphanages, settlements, mining camps, anywhere that children or vulnerable adults faced threats from those who possessed power without conscience. The wooden carvings had followed him, she realized. Small gifts left for those he protected as tokens that someone cared about their welfare, evidence that they possessed value that transcended their circumstances. Each horse, each bird, each carefully crafted animal had been infused with hours of patient work and the kind of love that asks nothing in return but the knowledge that suffering has been eased, even briefly. "The nightmares," she said, pieces of his story falling into place with devastating clarity. "They're not just from the war, are they? They're from all the times you weren't fast enough, all the children you couldn't save, all the situations where protection arrived too late to prevent the damage." His stillness confirmed her intuition, the careful way he held his massive frame speaking to the weight of memories that would crush most people under their accumulated burden. She understood now why he maintained such rigid control over his physical presence, why every movement was calculated to avoid causing alarm or intimidation. Someone who had spent 15 years intervening in situations where violence was the last resort had learned to view his own strength as a weapon that required constant management. The carved horse seemed to pulse with warmth in her hands as she contemplated the magnitude of what fate had delivered to her door. This was not a dangerous criminal whose labor she had purchased for $3. But the guardian angel who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be truly protected. The boy who had been lost to false accusations had become a man whose entire existence was devoted to ensuring that others did not suffer the abandonment and betrayal that had defined his own experience. "I looked for you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper as she confessed to searches that had consumed months of her teenage years. "After I left the children's home, I tried to find you. I wanted to thank you for everything you had done, wanted you to know that your kindness had made a difference that lasted long after you were gone." His hooded head tilted slightly, and she could sense his surprise at the revelation that anyone had cared enough about his welfare to seek him out. The isolation that had defined his adult life had clearly included the assumption that his disappearance from people's lives was met with relief rather than loss, that the protection he provided was valued only while circumstances made it necessary. "I never stopped hoping that someday our paths would cross again," she continued, the words emerging with an honesty that surprised her with its intensity. "Even when logic suggested it was impossible, even when years passed without any trace of where you had gone, some part of me remained convinced that fate would find a way to bring you back into my life." The recognition that had been building since his arrival at her property finally crystallized into certainty about the forces that had guided their reunion. The auction that had seemed like desperate circumstance was revealed as something approaching destiny, the intersection of her need for protection with his need for sanctuary. The $3 she had spent had purchased not just labor but the return of the most important relationship of her formative years. As morning gave way to afternoon, they talked with the desperate intensity of people making up for 15 years of separation and silence. Marcus gradually revealed the scope of the work that had defined his adult existence. The network of informal guardians who appeared when official systems failed, who intervened when law enforcement proved inadequate or corrupted,
who ensured that justice operated even in places where it was not officially welcome. The reputation for violence that had preceded him to the auction block was earned through confrontations with those who exploited the vulnerable, situations where negotiation and appeals to conscience had proved insufficient to stop ongoing harm. Each instance of force had been carefully calculated, precisely applied, designed to neutralize threats, while minimizing collateral damage. The very control that made him seem dangerous to those who did not know him was evidence of his commitment to using violence only as a last resort. "The man you're accused of killing," she said, understanding beginning to dawn about the circumstances that had led to his current legal troubles. "He was threatening someone who couldn't protect themselves, wasn't he?" His nod confirmed what she had suspected, another chapter in a story that seemed to repeat itself wherever Marcus went. Someone in authority using their position to harm those who should have been under their protection. Someone whose crimes were shielded by badges and institutional power. Someone who had made the mistake of believing that their victims had no champion willing to risk everything for their safety. The details emerged slowly, painted through careful gestures and the few words he was willing to speak about events that clearly continued to haunt him. A young woman, barely more than a child, trapped in circumstances that had left her vulnerable to a predator whose official position made him seem untouchable. A confrontation that had escalated beyond negotiation when the official in question had made it clear that he viewed his authority as license for behavior that crossed every line of human decency. "He left you no choice," she said, understanding the impossible calculation that had led to the violence that now threatened his freedom. "Just like always, you appeared when someone needed protection, and you did whatever it took to keep them safe." The weight of that recognition settled between them like a sacred trust, the knowledge that she now possessed complete understanding of who Marcus Sullivan truly was and what his presence in her life represented. This was not a criminal seeking to escape justice, but a guardian whose commitment to protecting others had finally placed him beyond the reach of official mercy. The same instincts that had made him invaluable to vulnerable children had ultimately marked him as a threat to those who profited from their exploitation. As evening approached and the golden light of autumn began painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold, Isabella found herself standing at the threshold of a decision that would define the rest of her life. The safe choice would be to report his true identity to the authorities, to claim whatever reward might be offered for information leading to his capture, to return to the solitary struggle that had defined her existence before his arrival. But looking at this man who had risked everything to ensure her survival as a vulnerable child, who had sacrificed his reputation and freedom to protect others who had no voice or power, who had appeared at her moment of greatest need bearing the same gentle strength that had once saved her from despair, Isabella realized that some debts transcended law and convention and the simple mathematics of self-preservation. The wooden horse in her hand seemed to whisper of choices that honored love over fear, loyalty over safety, the kind of courage that had once been demonstrated by a stable master who had chosen exile rather than abandon his protective duties. The circle that had begun 15 years ago in a Pittsburgh orphanage was finally closing, bringing together two souls whose destinies had been intertwined by tragedy, shaped by separation and now reunited by circumstances that seemed to bear the fingerprints of something larger than mere chance. Part 3: Current Struggles and Isolation. The ledger book lay open on Isabella's kitchen table like an accusation, its columns of figures telling a story of gradual decline that no amount of creative accounting could disguise. $27.38 remained of what had once been a modest but sustainable inheritance. Barely enough to cover the most essential supplies for another month, certainly insufficient to address the mounting repairs that threatened to transform Carter's Rest Inn from a struggling business into an uninhabitable ruin. She traced her finger down the entries that documented the property's slide toward insolvency, each line representing a choice between immediate necessity and long-term stability. A compromise that had seemed reasonable at the time but which collectively painted a picture of inexorable decay. The roof repair that had been postponed in favor of buying grain for the horse. The broken window in the upper guest room that remained covered with oiled paper because glass was a luxury she could not afford. The advertising in the county newspaper that had been discontinued when the cost became impossible to justify. Given the declining number of travelers willing to risk the inn's increasingly shabby accommodations, Marcus moved through the property with the methodical thoroughness of someone conducting a professional assessment, his trained eye cataloging problems that would require attention before winter's arrival made outdoor work impossible. She watched from the kitchen window as he examined the foundation stones, tested the stability of fence posts, checked the condition of shingles that had been loosened by recent storms. His expertise was evident in the careful way he prioritized tasks, identifying issues that threatened structural integrity versus those that merely affected appearance. The property that had once represented prosperity and promise now served primarily as a monument to dreams deferred by circumstances beyond her control. Her grandfather had constructed the inn during the region's coal boom, when Millbrook County hummed with the activity of profitable mines and the constant flow of travelers who required food and lodging during their journeys between Pittsburgh and the emerging industrial centers of western Pennsylvania. Those days seemed as distant as mythology now, replaced by economic depression that had closed half the mines and reduced the once thriving county to a collection of struggling communities connected by roads that carried more hope than actual commerce. The guest registry that had once filled 2 or 3 pages per week now showed days and sometimes entire weeks without a single visitor. The travelers who did stop were typically individuals whose circumstances made them grateful for any shelter, regardless of its condition. People whose few coins barely covered the cost of their accommodations and left nothing to contribute toward the maintenance expenses that accumulated with relentless persistence. Isabella had tried everything she could imagine to reverse the property's decline. She had lowered rates to attract more customers, only to discover that cheaper prices attracted guests whose behavior sometimes cost more in damages than their fees provided in revenue. She had attempted to supplement income by selling vegetables from the garden, but the economic conditions that affected her business also reduced her neighbors' ability to purchase anything beyond absolute necessities. She had even considered taking in permanent boarders, but the isolation that made Carter's Rest Inn attractive as a temporary refuge made it less appealing as a long-term residence. The solitude that had once seemed peaceful had gradually transformed into something approaching imprisonment. Her nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away over roads that became impassable during heavy rain or snow, and the social connections that had sustained her during her father's lifetime had withered under the pressure of economic hardship that made visiting seem like an indulgence no one could afford. Days passed without conversation beyond the few words exchanged with occasional guests, weeks without the sound of another human voice raised in laughter or shared concern. The isolation was more than physical. It extended to the gradual erosion of hope that had once sustained her through difficult periods. Each failed attempt to restore the inn's profitability had reduced her confidence in her ability to solve problems that seemed to multiply faster than her resources could address them. The competence she had inherited from her father, the practical skills that had once made her proud of her independence, now seemed inadequate to the challenges that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. Marcus's presence had initially provided relief that she had almost forgotten was possible. The simple comfort of knowing that someone else was aware of her struggles and willing to share the burden of addressing them. But as days passed and she observed the scope of his capabilities, the relief had been joined by a more complex emotion that she was reluctant to examine too closely. His quiet competence highlighted the extent to which she had been failing to maintain what previous generations had built. His ease with tasks that had seemed insurmountable to her serving as evidence of her own inadequacy. The financial pressures that had driven her to the auction were more severe than she had admitted even to herself. The tax assessment that would arrive with spring carried obligations she had no realistic prospect of meeting. Debts that would force the sale of property that had been in her family for 3 generations. The shame of losing what her grandfather had built through his own labor, what her father had maintained through decades of patient stewardship, seemed almost worse than the practical consequences of homelessness and destitution. She had exhausted the few resources that might have provided temporary relief. The bank that held the inn's small mortgage had already demonstrated its unwillingness to extend additional credit to someone whose business showed no prospect of improved profitability. Her father's few friends who had survived the economic downturn were struggling with their own difficulties and could offer sympathy but not financial assistance. The county's welfare provisions were designed for families with children rather than single women whose property ownership, however precarious, technically placed them above the threshold for official poverty relief. The emotional toll of prolonged struggle had been as devastating as the financial consequences. The optimism that had once sustained her through temporary setbacks had been eroded by the accumulated weight of problems that seemed to have no solutions. Challenges that persisted regardless of how much effort she devoted to addressing them. Sleep had become elusive, her rest interrupted by anxiety about bills coming due, repairs becoming urgent, winter approaching with its promise of expenses she could not afford, and isolation that would become absolute when snow made travel impossible. The few social connections that remained had been strained by her inability to reciprocate the kindness that others had shown during the worst periods of her struggle. When neighbors had brought food during her father's final illness, she had been unable to return the gesture when their own family members faced similar crises. When friends had offered assistance with urgent repairs, she had been forced to decline because accepting help would have meant acknowledging the extent of her financial desperation to people whose good opinion remained one of her few remaining assets. Marcus seemed to understand the complexities of her situation without requiring detailed explanation. His own experience with economic hardship and social isolation providing insight into struggles that well-meaning people often failed to comprehend. He worked on the property's most urgent problems without discussing payment or expectations. His labor offered with the kind of generosity that asked nothing in return but the opportunity to be useful to someone whose need was genuine and immediate. His approach to the inn's problems was systematic and methodical, addressing underlying issues rather than simply treating symptoms. When he repaired the loose foundation stones, he took time to improve drainage that would prevent future frost damage. His work on the roof went beyond simple patching to include reinforcement of supports that had been weakened by years of weather exposure. Every task was completed with attention to long-term functionality rather than temporary fixes that would require repeated attention. The change in her daily reality was profound. Tasks that had seemed overwhelming when faced alone became manageable when shared with someone whose competence matched his obvious physical strength. The constant anxiety about maintaining basic systems began to ease as crucial repairs were completed with materials that appeared through means she did not question and did not feel entitled to investigate. For the first time since her father's death, Isabella allowed herself to imagine that Carter's Rest Inn might survive the economic pressures that had been threatening its existence. But the relief was complicated by awareness that Marcus's presence was temporary, that whatever circumstances had brought him to the auction would eventually require resolution that might take him away from the sanctuary he had found at her property. The legal troubles that had reduced him to the status of human commodity would not disappear simply because he had found temporary refuge. And she had no illusions about her ability to protect him from authorities whose resources far exceeded anything she could bring to bear on his behalf. The practical improvements he was making to the property would outlast his presence, but the emotional support his companionship provided was irreplaceable and therefore more precious than any material contribution. The simple knowledge that someone else was aware of her struggles, that her daily battles against decline and decay were witnessed and shared, had restored a sense of purpose that had been slowly dying under the weight of prolonged isolation. She found herself studying his movements as he worked, trying to memorize the competent way he approached each task, the patient problem-solving that characterized his interactions with stubborn machinery and recalcitrant building materials. There was something deeply reassuring about his physical presence, the way his massive frame seemed to absorb and neutralize the various anxieties that had been her constant companions for months. When he was working nearby, the familiar sounds of maintenance and repair created an atmosphere of productive activity that made the inn feel alive in ways it had not since her father's death. The contrast between her current circumstances and the security she remembered from childhood was stark enough to be painful. The inn had once been filled with the sounds of guests coming and going, conversations in the common room that extended late into the evening, the comfortable bustle of a business that served an essential function for travelers who appreciated clean accommodations and
Hearty meals. Her father had possessed the kind of natural authority that made guests feel welcome while maintaining the standards that kept the establishment profitable and respectable. She had inherited his commitment to hospitality but lacked the economic conditions that had made his success possible. The steady stream of travelers who could afford to pay rates that covered expenses and provided modest profit for reinvestment and expansion. The skills that had served him well during prosperous times proved inadequate when applied to an economy that offered few opportunities and fewer rewards for honest labor and fair dealing. Marcus's evening routine had become as familiar as her own. The sound of his footsteps as he checked the property's security before retiring to the small room behind the kitchen. She had taken to leaving a lamp burning in the window, a gesture that seemed to provide comfort during the dark hours when his nightmares visited with devastating regularity. The vigils she maintained during his worst episodes had become as much a part of her schedule as morning chores and evening prayers, moments of shared humanity that connected them across the barriers of trauma and social convention. The wooden horse that had triggered their mutual recognition now occupied a place of honor on her kitchen windowsill, its polished surface catching morning light in ways that seemed to promise better days ahead. She had found herself reaching for it during moments of particular discouragement, drawing comfort from its solid weight and the knowledge that skilled hands had shaped it with care and patience that transcended any practical purpose. The carving represented more than artistic ability. It embodied the kind of hope that persisted despite evidence that circumstances were unlikely to improve significantly. As autumn deepened toward winter and the first hard frosts began killing the last of the garden's productivity, Isabella realized that the man who had appeared at her moment of greatest need was facing his own crisis of uncertain duration and potentially devastating consequences. The protection he had provided during her vulnerable childhood had been offered freely, with no expectation of repayment or recognition. Now fate had presented her with the opportunity to return that protection, to offer sanctuary to someone whose entire adult life had been devoted to ensuring that others did not suffer the abandonment and betrayal that had shaped his own experience. The decision she faced was more complex than simple arithmetic of risk versus reward. Harboring someone wanted by federal authorities would expose her to legal consequences that could destroy what remained of her financial security and social standing. But turning away the person who had saved her from despair during the most vulnerable period of her life would represent a betrayal of values that her father had instilled and that had defined her understanding of right and wrong throughout her adult years. Part 4. The Foundational Trauma. The memory surfaced on the 15th anniversary of her parents' death, triggered by the particular quality of autumn light that filtered through the kitchen windows and painted everything in shades of gold and amber that belonged to another time, another life. Another version of herself who had believed the world was fundamentally safe for children who behaved well and trusted in adult protection. Isabella stood at the window overlooking the property that had become both sanctuary and prison, watching Marcus work in the distance, when suddenly she was 12 years old again and the universe was revealing its capacity for arbitrary cruelty. The telegram that had changed everything had arrived on a Tuesday morning when frost still silvered the grass and her breath made small clouds in the crisp air of early October. She remembered the sound of approaching hoofbeats, the official bearing of the messenger who had dismounted with the careful formality that adults adopt when they must deliver news that will shatter a child's understanding of how the world operates. Her parents had been traveling to Pittsburgh on business related to her father's lumber interests, a routine journey that had been undertaken dozens of times without incident or particular concern. The train wreck that had claimed their lives had been the result of mechanical failure combined with human error, a combination of circumstances that investigators would later describe as unavoidable but which felt to 12-year-old Isabella like evidence that safety was an illusion. Adults maintained to keep children from understanding the fundamental randomness of existence. 43 people had died when the passenger cars had derailed while crossing a bridge over the Allegheny River. Their bodies claimed by dark water that had refused to surrender its victims for weeks after the disaster. The funeral had been conducted without bodies to bury, a service that felt incomplete and surreal to someone whose understanding of death had been shaped by her grandmother's peaceful passing in the bed where she had slept for 40 years. The absence of physical remains had made acceptance impossible, had left room for the kind of desperate hope that insisted her parents might have somehow survived, might even now be making their way home to the daughter who waited with faith that bordered on delusion. The legal proceedings that had followed had been conducted with the brisk efficiency that adults apply to situations involving children whose emotional needs are secondary to practical concerns about guardianship and property disposition. The lumber business that had provided their family's prosperity was dissolved to satisfy debts that had seemed manageable during her father's lifetime, but which became overwhelming when removed from his personal oversight and business relationships. The house where 3 generations of her family had lived was sold to cover obligations that no one had anticipated would need immediate settlement. She had become a ward of the county, a legal status that translated into placement at the Pittsburgh Children's Home, an institution whose name suggested care and nurturing but whose reality was shaped more by budgetary constraints than genuine concern for the welfare of its residents. The building had been constructed during an earlier era when charitable organizations possessed both greater resources and different philosophies about the treatment of dependent children. But decades of reduced funding had transformed it into a place where survival often depended more on luck than official protection. The children's home housed approximately 60 residents ranging in age from infancy to 16. A population that changed constantly as younger children were adopted and older ones were expelled to make their own way in a world that offered few opportunities for those without family connections or marketable skills. The staff was small and overworked, well-meaning people whose good intentions were undermined by impossible caseloads and institutional policies that prioritized order over individual attention. Isabella's arrival at the home had coincided with a period of particular instability in the institution's management. The director who had maintained some semblance of caring oversight had recently died, and his replacement was a man whose previous experience had been in managing adult workhouses rather than caring for dependent children. The new policies he had implemented reflected his belief that charitable institutions should prepare their residents for lives of hard labor rather than fostering unrealistic expectations about their future prospects. The dormitory where she had been assigned housed 12 girls ranging in age from 8 to 15. Sleeping in narrow beds arranged with military precision and supervised by a matron whose primary qualification appeared to be her ability to maintain silence during the dark hours when fear and homesickness transformed sleeping quarters into places of barely contained desperation. The older girls had developed survival strategies that often came at the expense of newer residents, and Isabella had quickly learned that vulnerability was a luxury she could not afford. The daily routine was structured around work assignments that were presented as character-building exercises, but which functioned primarily as free labor for the institution's operations. Children as young as 6 were expected to contribute to laundry, food preparation, cleaning, and maintenance tasks that reduced operational costs while teaching what administrators called valuable life skills. The education provided was minimal, focused on basic literacy and arithmetic that would prepare residents for positions as domestic servants or manual laborers. It was during her second week at the institution that Isabella had first encountered Marcus, though she had not learned his name until much later. She had been assigned to assist with stable duties, work that involved mucking out stalls, carrying water, and performing other tasks that were both physically demanding and emotionally isolating for someone whose previous contact with horses had been limited to admiring them from a distance. The stable master had been a figure of some mystery among the children, a tall man who performed his duties with quiet efficiency and who seemed to possess the kind of natural authority that made both animals and people comfortable in his presence. Unlike many of the institution's staff members, he had spoken to the children assigned to stable work with genuine respect, treating them as individuals whose thoughts and feelings mattered rather than as interchangeable units of labor. Isabella's first riding lesson had occurred by accident, the result of her obvious fear when assigned to lead one of the gentler horses from the stable to the small paddock where exercise was conducted under supervision. Marcus had observed her distress and had quietly offered to teach her the basic skills that would make the work less frightening, instruction that had quickly evolved into something approaching genuine horsemanship as her natural aptitude became apparent. The lessons had taken place during evening hours when official duties were completed and other staff members had retired to their quarters, unofficial instruction that violated no specific rules but which clearly exceeded the basic job requirements that defined Marcus's position at the institution. He had possessed endless patience with her initial clumsiness, the kind of gentle persistence that helped her understand that mastery came through practice rather than innate talent. More than riding technique, he had taught her about horses as individual creatures with distinct personalities and preferences, knowledge that had transformed her relationship with animals from fearful obligation to genuine partnership. Under his guidance, she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a horse's mood and health, to communicate through touch and voice in ways that created cooperation rather than demanding submission. The mare she had eventually been permitted to ride regularly was an aging bay named Duchess, whose gentle temperament and reliable gaits had made her ideal for nervous beginners. Duchess had possessed the kind of patient intelligence that made her seem almost human in her responses to Isabella's emotional state, offering comfort during the dark periods when grief threatened to overwhelm her entirely and celebrating small victories with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. The hours spent in Duchess's company had provided the closest thing to peace that Isabella had experienced since receiving news of her parents' death. The rhythmic motion of riding had soothed anxieties that talking could not address, and the responsibility of caring for another living creature had given her days structure and purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Marcus had somehow understood that the riding lessons were serving needs that went far beyond practical education about animal husbandry. Their conversations during those evening sessions had ranged over topics that other adults seemed to consider inappropriate for children who had experienced significant loss. Marcus had neither minimized her grief nor attempted to hurry her through the mourning process, instead offering the kind of honest acknowledgement that her feelings were both valid and temporary. Part 3. Return to present reality. The stark contrast between past security and present uncertainty pressed against Isabella's consciousness like a weight that threatened to crush what remained of her carefully maintained composure. Standing in the kitchen that had once been the heart of a thriving establishment, she surveyed the evidence of decline that no amount of determined optimism could disguise. The copper pots that had gleamed during her father's lifetime now bore the green patina of neglect, their surfaces telling stories of meals prepared with decreasing frequency as guests became an increasingly rare commodity rather than the steady stream of travelers who had once filled every room. The account books spread across the worn wooden table painted a picture of gradual economic strangulation that had accelerated dramatically in recent months. Coal shipments that had once provided steady income for the region's businesses had slowed to a trickle as eastern markets found cheaper alternatives, leaving Millbrook County isolated from the prosperity that had justified its existence. The railroad that had brought progress and opportunity now carried away the young people who possessed sufficient education and ambition to seek their fortunes in cities where industries still flourished. Marcus moved through the property with the systematic attention of someone conducting a thorough assessment, his trained eye cataloging problems that would require immediate attention before winter transformed them from inconveniences into genuine threats to habitability. She watched from the window as he examined the stone foundation where frost had shifted several blocks out of alignment, tested fence posts that leaned at angles suggesting their anchoring had been compromised by repeated freeze-thaw cycles, and checked the condition of roof shingles that had been loosened by autumn storms. The financial calculations that had once seemed manageable now resembled an arithmetic of desperation that offered no realistic solutions to problems that multiplied faster than her diminishing resources could address them. The property taxes that would come due with spring represented an obligation that exceeded her total liquid assets, and the maintenance expenses required to keep the inn minimally functional threatened to consume what little remained of her inheritance before winter reached its conclusion.
She had attempted every strategy she could devise to reverse the establishment's economic decline. Advertising in regional newspapers had produced inquiries but few actual bookings, the cost of promotional materials exceeding the revenue generated by the customers they attracted. Reducing rates to compete with newer establishments had succeeded only in attracting guests whose behavior sometimes resulted in damages that exceeded their fees, leaving her worse off than if the rooms had remained empty. The isolation that had once seemed like peaceful retreat from urban complications had transformed into something approaching imprisonment as economic pressures reduced social connections to their most essential elements. Neighbors who had once gathered for seasonal celebrations and mutual assistance now struggled with their own survival, their visits becoming increasingly rare as winter weather made travel difficult and social calls seemed like luxuries no one could afford. The few friends who remained from her father's generation possessed neither the resources nor the inclination to involve themselves in what appeared to be a losing battle against economic forces beyond individual control. Their sympathy was genuine but useless, their advice well-intentioned but irrelevant to circumstances that demanded practical solutions rather than moral support or emotional encouragement. Marcus's presence had initially provided relief so profound that she had been reluctant to examine its implications too closely, afraid that analysis might somehow diminish the comfort his competence provided. But as days passed and she observed the scope of his capabilities, she began to understand that fate had delivered to her door not merely additional labor but expertise that could address problems she had been unable to solve through her own efforts. The systematic approach he brought to the property's maintenance needs was unlike anything she had previously experienced. Rather than simply addressing the most obvious symptoms of neglect, he identified underlying causes that would continue generating problems until properly corrected. His repair of the loose foundation stones included improvements to drainage that would prevent future frost damage. His work on the roof extended beyond patching obvious leaks to include reinforcement of supports that had been gradually weakened by decades of weather exposure. The materials required for these repairs appeared through means she did not question, partly because she lacked the resources to purchase them herself, and partly because she suspected the explanations would involve activities she preferred not to know about in detail. Whether he had salvaged supplies from abandoned properties, negotiated trades with other craftsmen, or employed methods that skirted the edges of legal property acquisition, the result spoke to resourcefulness that complemented his obvious technical skills. The change in her daily reality was profound enough to seem almost miraculous to someone who had grown accustomed to facing each day's challenges in solitude. Tasks that had seemed overwhelming when confronted alone became manageable when shared with someone whose physical strength was matched by practical knowledge accumulated through years of similar work. The constant anxiety about maintaining basic systems began to ease as crucial repairs were completed with attention to long-term functionality rather than temporary fixes. The emotional impact of having reliable companionship was perhaps even more significant than the practical benefits his labor provided. The simple knowledge that someone else was aware of her struggles, that her daily battles against decline and decay were witnessed and shared, had restored a sense of purpose that had been slowly eroding under the weight of prolonged isolation and repeated failure. But the relief was complicated by awareness that his presence represented borrowed time rather than permanent solution to problems that would persist long after whatever circumstances had brought him to her property were eventually resolved. The legal troubles that had reduced him to commodity status at a county auction would not disappear simply because he had found temporary sanctuary, and she possessed no illusions about her ability to protect him from authorities whose resources far exceeded anything she could mobilize on his behalf. The gradual revelation of his true identity had transformed her understanding of their relationship from simple employer-employee arrangement to something far more complex and emotionally charged. The recognition that this was the same person who had provided crucial support during the most vulnerable period of her childhood created obligations that transcended practical considerations about labor and compensation, debts that could never be calculated in monetary terms or satisfied through conventional forms of payment. The wooden horse that had triggered their mutual recognition had acquired the status of sacred object, its presence on her windowsill serving as daily reminder of connections that spanned decades and circumstances that seemed designed to test the durability of human loyalty. The carving represented more than artistic skill, it embodied the kind of patient care that had characterized his approach to protecting vulnerable children, the attention to detail that transformed practical objects into tokens of affection and hope. The nightmares that visited him with devastating regularity had become as much a part of her routine as morning chores and evening meals, vigils that connected them across barriers of trauma and social convention. During these dark hours when his sleep was shattered by memories too painful for conscious examination, she provided whatever comfort silence and presence could offer, bearing witness to suffering she could not fully comprehend, but which clearly shaped every aspect of his waking existence. The scope of sacrifice his adult life had represented was becoming clearer as she pieced together fragments of his story through careful observation and the few details he was willing to share. 15 years of moving from place to place, appearing wherever protection was needed, and disappearing before relationships could form or questions could penetrate too deeply. 15 years of placing the welfare of strangers above his own safety, comfort, or hope for the kind of stable personal connections that most people considered essential to meaningful existence. The reputation for violence that had preceded him to the auction block was revealed through this lens as evidence of his commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. Confrontations with predators whose official positions or social standing had made them seem untouchable to conventional forms of justice. Each instance of force had been carefully calculated, precisely applied, designed to neutralize threats while minimizing collateral damage to innocent bystanders who might be caught in proximity to necessary violence. The man accused of murdering a federal official was revealed as someone whose entire adult existence had been devoted to ensuring that official authority was not used to exploit those it was supposed to protect. The charges against him represented not criminal behavior but the inevitable consequence of intervention in situations where negotiation and appeals to conscience had proved insufficient to stop ongoing harm to vulnerable individuals. The practical improvements he was making to her property would outlast his presence, but the emotional support his companionship provided was irreplaceable and therefore more precious than any material contribution. The knowledge that someone understood her struggles, that her efforts to maintain what previous generations had built were witnessed and valued, had restored confidence that had been gradually eroding under the pressure of repeated setbacks and accumulating problems. She found herself studying his movements as he worked, trying to memorize the competent way he approached each challenge. The patient problem-solving that characterized his interactions with stubborn machinery and recalcitrant building materials. There was something deeply reassuring about his physical presence, the way his massive frame seemed to absorb and neutralize the various anxieties that had been her constant companions since her father's death. The contrast between her current circumstances and the security she remembered from childhood was painful but also instructive, highlighting how much of her previous happiness had depended on the presence of strong, competent people who had taken responsibility for maintaining the systems that allowed daily life to proceed without constant crisis. Her father had possessed natural authority that made guests feel welcome while maintaining standards that kept the establishment profitable and respectable, skills that had seemed effortless, but which she now understood, required extensive experience and careful judgment. The economic conditions that had supported her family's prosperity no longer existed, replaced by regional depression that offered few opportunities for honest business and fewer rewards for the kind of principled service that had once defined successful hospitality establishments. The travelers who had once filled every room were now either unable to afford commercial accommodations or reluctant to venture into areas where economic decline had reduced services to their most basic levels. The few guests who did occasionally appear were typically individuals whose circumstances made them grateful for any shelter, regardless of its condition. People whose modest payments barely covered the cost of their accommodations and left nothing to contribute toward the maintenance expenses that accumulated with relentless persistence. Their presence was welcome but insufficient to address the fundamental economic challenges that threatened the property's viability. Marcus's evening routine had become as familiar as her own, the sound of his careful footsteps as he checked the property's security before retiring to the small room behind the kitchen that had been designed for hired help during the inn's more prosperous years. She had taken to leaving a lamp burning in the kitchen window, a gesture that seemed to provide comfort during the dark hours when his demons visited with clockwork regularity. The isolation that had defined her existence since her father's death was being gradually replaced by the kind of companionable routine that she had almost forgotten was possible between people whose lives had been shaped by loss and disappointment. Their conversations were limited by his reluctance to discuss his past in detail and her awareness that pressing for information might drive him away. But the communication that occurred through shared work and mutual concern was often more meaningful than extensive verbal exchange. The approaching winter represented challenges that would test both the property's physical integrity and their ability to maintain the fragile stability they had achieved through careful cooperation and mutual support. The heating costs required to keep the building habitable during Pennsylvania's harsh winters would strain her limited resources, and the isolation that snow would bring might make outside assistance impossible to obtain if emergencies arose. But for the first time since her father's death, Isabella felt prepared to face seasonal difficulties with something other than resignation and anxiety. The presence of someone who understood both the practical demands of property maintenance and the emotional toll of extended isolation had restored her confidence in her ability to preserve what previous generations had built through their own labor and sacrifice. The recognition that their partnership was based on shared values rather than simple economic exchange created the possibility that it might endure beyond the immediate crisis that had brought them together. The loyalty he had demonstrated during her vulnerable childhood had been freely given, with no expectation of eventual reward or recognition. The opportunity to return that protection, to offer sanctuary to someone whose entire adult life had been devoted to ensuring others did not suffer abandonment and betrayal, represented the kind of meaningful purpose that had been missing from her existence for longer than she cared to acknowledge. The ledger books that had once documented only decline and approaching failure now recorded evidence of systematic improvement that gave reason for cautious optimism about the property's future viability. The repairs that were being completed with Marcus's labor and expertise would extend the
building's useful life and reduce maintenance costs that had been consuming an unsustainable portion of her limited income. More importantly, the renewed sense of purpose that his presence had restored was beginning to generate ideas about alternative uses for the property that might provide income streams less dependent on the regional economic recovery that seemed increasingly unlikely to occur within any reasonable time frame. The skills she possessed in hospitality management might be adapted to serve different markets, and the combination of his practical expertise with her business knowledge might create opportunities that neither could pursue alone. The wooden horse on her windowsill caught the afternoon light in ways that seemed to promise better days ahead, its polished surface reflecting possibilities that had seemed impossible during the darkest periods of her solitary struggle. The carving represented more than artistic ability. It embodied hope that persisted despite evidence that circumstances were unlikely to improve through conventional means. As evening approached and the golden light of late autumn began painting the landscape in shades that belonged to her most cherished memories, Isabella realized that the decision she faced was more complex than simple arithmetic of risk versus reward. The practical considerations about harboring someone wanted by federal authorities were significant, but they paled beside the moral obligation she felt towards someone who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be truly protected during the most formative period of her development. Part 4. The Foundational Trauma. The anniversary arrived without ceremony, marked only by the particular quality of late autumn light that filtered through windows and painted everything in shades of gold that belonged to another lifetime. 20 years had passed since the morning that had divided Isabella's existence into before and after, but the memory surfaced with devastating clarity as she stood in the kitchen watching Marcus work in the distance, his massive frame moving with the careful deliberation that characterized all his actions. She had been 7 years old when the typhoid outbreak had swept through their neighborhood like a biblical plague, claiming lives with the arbitrary cruelty that disease visits upon communities whose sanitation systems and medical resources prove inadequate to contain microscopic enemies that recognize no boundaries of class or virtue. The epidemic had begun in the poorest sections of Pittsburgh, where immigrants crowded into tenements that lacked proper waste disposal and clean water access. But it had spread with devastating efficiency to areas that had previously considered themselves safely isolated from such urban problems. Her parents had been among the first wave of victims, succumbing to the fever and delirium that characterized the disease's final stages within days of each other. Their deaths occurring so rapidly that 7-year-old Isabella had barely had time to understand the magnitude of what was happening before she found herself alone in a world that suddenly seemed vast and threatening beyond anything her limited experience had prepared her to navigate. The adults who had stepped in to manage the aftermath of her parents' deaths had been well-meaning but overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis affecting their community. The epidemic had created dozens of orphans within a matter of weeks, children whose relatives were either dead, too ill to assume responsibility, or too frightened of contagion to risk taking additional family members into their homes. The institutional resources designed to handle such emergencies had been quickly overwhelmed by demand that exceeded capacity by factors that made individual attention impossible. The Pittsburgh Children's Home had been her destination not through careful placement designed to meet her specific needs, but through the simple arithmetic of available space and urgent necessity. The institution had been operating beyond its intended capacity even before the epidemic, and the sudden influx of newly orphaned children had transformed it from an overcrowded facility into something approaching a warehouse for displaced humanity. Her arrival at the children's home had coincided with a period of transition that had exacerbated the already difficult conditions facing residents. The previous director, a woman whose dedication to the children's welfare had been genuine despite limited resources, had herself fallen victim to the typhoid outbreak, leaving the institution under temporary management that prioritized order and control over the kind of individual attention that traumatized children required for psychological survival. The dormitory where she had been assigned had housed 16 girls ranging in age from 5 to 14, sleeping in narrow beds arranged with institutional efficiency and supervised by matrons whose primary qualification appeared to be their ability to maintain silence during the dark hours when fear and homesickness transformed sleeping quarters into echo chambers of barely contained desperation. The older girls had developed survival strategies that often came at the expense of newer residents, and Isabella had quickly learned that vulnerability was a luxury she could no longer afford. The daily routine had been structured around work assignments that were presented as character-building exercises, but which functioned primarily as free labor that reduced the institution's operational costs. Children as young as 6 were expected to contribute to laundry, food preparation, cleaning, and maintenance tasks that taught what administrators called valuable life skills while ensuring that the facility could operate with minimal paid staff. The education provided had been rudimentary at best, focused on basic literacy and arithmetic that would prepare residents for positions as domestic servants or manual laborers rather than fostering intellectual development that might create unrealistic expectations about their future prospects. The assumption underlying the entire system was that children without family resources would naturally assume places at the bottom of social and economic hierarchies, and that preparing them for anything else would constitute cruel deception about their realistic options. It had been during her 3rd week at the institution that Isabella had first encountered Marcus, though she had not learned his name until much later in their relationship. The assignment of children to various work details had been conducted with little attention to individual aptitudes or preferences, and she had found herself designated for stable duties despite having no previous experience with horses beyond admiring them from a safe distance during her family's occasional trips to market. The stables had been located at the rear of the institutional complex, a collection of buildings that housed the horses used for transportation and the occasional delivery of supplies that could not be obtained through other means. The work had been both physically demanding and emotionally isolating for someone whose previous contact with large animals had been limited to the family cat and the occasional friendly dog encountered during neighborhood walks. Marcus had been serving as stable master, a position that carried both responsibility and relative independence within the institution's hierarchy. Unlike many staff members who viewed their charges as burdens to be managed rather than individuals deserving care and attention, he had treated the children assigned to stable work with genuine respect, speaking to them as people whose thoughts and feelings mattered rather than as interchangeable units of labor. Isabella's terror of the horses had been obvious from her first day in the stables, her small frame trembling with fear whenever she was required to approach animals that seemed enormous and unpredictable to someone whose understanding of their behavior was based on childhood stories that emphasized their capacity for sudden violence. Marcus had observed her distress with the kind of patient attention that recognized fear as a problem to be solved rather than a weakness to be criticized. The first riding lesson had occurred by necessity rather than design, the result of a situation that required her to lead one of the gentler horses from the stable to the small paddock where exercise was conducted under supervision. Her obvious terror had threatened to create a dangerous situation for both child and animal, prompting Marcus to intervene with instruction that began as simple safety guidance but quickly evolved into systematic education about horsemanship. The mare selected for her initial instruction had been an aging bay named Duchess, whose gentle temperament and reliable gaits had made her ideal for nervous beginners. Duchess had possessed the kind of patient intelligence that made her seem almost human in her responses to emotional distress, offering comfort through her calm presence and celebrating small victories with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Under Marcus's guidance, Isabella had gradually learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a horse's mood and intentions, to communicate through touch and voice in ways that created cooperation rather than demanding submission through force or intimidation. The lessons had taken place during evening hours when official duties were completed and other staff members had retired to their quarters, unofficial instruction that violated no specific rules but which clearly exceeded the basic job requirements that defined his position. The transformation from terror to confidence had been gradual but profound, each successful interaction building upon previous achievements until riding became not just possible but genuinely enjoyable. The rhythmic motion of Duchess's gaits had provided comfort that talking could not address, and the responsibility of caring for another living creature had given Isabella's days structure and purpose that extended beyond mere institutional survival. More than technical instruction, Marcus had provided the kind of emotional support that helped her understand that competence could be developed through practice and patience rather than being an innate quality that some people possessed while others remained forever inadequate. His teaching methods had emphasized understanding and partnership rather than dominance and control, lessons that had application far beyond the immediate context of horse management. The hours spent in Marcus's company had represented the closest thing to peace that Isabella had experienced since receiving news of her parents' death. The stable environment had offered refuge from the institutional tensions that characterized most of her waking hours, and his quiet presence had provided comfort without requiring her to articulate feelings that she lacked the vocabulary to express adequately. Their conversations during those evening sessions had ranged over topics that other adults seemed to consider inappropriate for children who had experienced significant loss. Marcus had neither minimized her grief nor attempted to hurry her through the mourning process, instead offering honest acknowledgement that her feelings were both valid and temporary, that healing was possible without forgetting, and that strength could be rebuilt even after devastating damage. He had spoken about his own experiences with loss in ways that helped her understand that survival was not a matter of individual virtue but often depended on the presence of people willing to offer support during the darkest periods of human experience. The stories he had shared during their time together had featured protagonists who faced circumstances similar to her own. Individuals whose courage and persistence had eventually led them to meaningful lives despite early experiences with tragedy and abandonment. At the time, she had assumed these narratives were simply entertaining fiction designed to pass time during routine stable work. Only years later had she begun to understand that each story had been carefully chosen therapy,
Narratives designed to plant seeds of possibility in ground that had been scorched by loss and disappointment. Every tale had ended with hope validated by reality, virtue rewarded with happiness, and courage leading to the kind of life she had barely dared to imagine for herself. The wooden horses that had appeared in her dormitory during that period had seemed like gifts from other children, tokens of friendship exchanged among residents who had little to share but who understood the comfort that could come from handmade objects that demonstrated someone had invested time and effort in their creation. The realization that Marcus had been their creator, that he had spent his evening hours crafting these beautiful carvings for children who had been abandoned by everyone else, had added dimensions to their relationship that she had been too young to fully appreciate. The security his protection had provided had extended beyond simple physical safety to include preservation of hope itself. In an environment where cynicism was often the most realistic response to institutional indifference and adult failure, he had somehow maintained belief in the possibility that circumstances could improve, that individual effort could overcome systemic problems, and that kindness existed even in places where it was not officially recognized or rewarded. The trust that had developed between them had been based on consistent demonstration that his promises could be relied upon, that his presence meant safety even in situations where other adults had proved unreliable or actively harmful. When older children had turned cruel, when staff members had proved indifferent to obvious injustice, when the weight of being unwanted had threatened to crush her spirit entirely, Marcus had somehow always appeared with tasks that required her assistance and coincidentally removed her from dangerous situations. His departure from the institution had been as sudden and inexplicable as his protection had been reliable and comprehensive. One morning she had arrived at the stables for their customary session, only to find his quarters empty and another staff member preparing to assume his duties. The explanations offered had been vague and contradictory, official statements about policy violations that made no sense to someone who had observed his consistent dedication to the children's welfare. The other children had whispered about investigations and accusations, adult politics that had somehow resulted in the removal of the one staff member who had consistently demonstrated genuine care for their well-being. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had settled over the institution in the aftermath of his departure had made clear that asking direct questions about his fate would be both futile and potentially dangerous for anyone naive enough to demonstrate excessive loyalty to someone who had fallen from official favor. The impact of his disappearance had been devastating in ways that had taken years for her to fully understand. Not only had she lost the person who had provided the most consistent source of comfort and protection during the most vulnerable period of her life, but his removal had destroyed her developing faith that adults could be trusted to keep their promises, or that safety was anything more than a temporary illusion that could be withdrawn without warning or explanation. The survival strategies she had developed in the aftermath of his departure had been based on the assumption that self-reliance was the only realistic protection against abandonment and betrayal. The lesson his disappearance had taught was that even the most dedicated protectors could be removed by forces beyond their control. That dependence on others was a form of vulnerability that invited eventual devastation when circumstances inevitably changed. But now, standing in her kitchen and watching this man whose identity had been confirmed by wooden horses and shared memories, Isabella began to understand that the lesson she had learned about the impossibility of lasting protection had been incomplete. Marcus had not chosen to abandon her. He had been forced to leave by circumstances that had threatened not only his own welfare but the safety of the children he had been trying to protect. The sacrifice his departure had represented was becoming clear as she pieced together the implications of what he had revealed about false accusations and institutional corruption. Rather than fighting charges that might have been defeated in court, he had chosen exile that preserved his ability to continue protective work elsewhere, accepting personal ruin to ensure that other vulnerable children would not suffer while he battled for vindication that might never come. The recognition that their reunion was not coincidence but the working of forces that had been shaping both their lives for decades created obligations that transcended practical considerations about risk and reward. The debt she owed for childhood protection had never been paid, never even properly acknowledged, but fate had now provided an opportunity to offer sanctuary to someone whose entire adult existence had been devoted to ensuring that others did not experience the abandonment and betrayal that had defined his own experience with institutional justice. The wedding dress had belonged to Isabella's grandmother, yellowed with age but still beautiful in its simplicity. She stood before the cracked mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the pearl buttons that caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that Marcus had recently repaired. The transformation of both the inn and her life seemed impossible to believe, yet here she was preparing to marry the man who had appeared at auction like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared voice. 3 months had passed since that terrible morning when federal authority had arrived to arrest Marcus. 3 months during which everything had changed in ways that defied logic and restored her faith in justice. The investigation that Marshal Hayes had promised had uncovered a web of corruption that reached far beyond the single incident that had made Marcus a wanted man. Crawford's activities had been part of a larger network of officials who had used their positions to exploit vulnerable populations across multiple territories. The evidence that Isabella had preserved had proven crucial to unraveling the conspiracy, but it was Marcus's own testimony that had ultimately exposed the full scope of the criminal enterprise. His years of careful documentation, the detailed records he had maintained of every intervention and every corrupt official he had encountered, painted a picture of systematic abuse that federal investigators could no longer ignore or dismiss as isolated incidents. The child whose photograph had moved Marshal Hayes to reconsider the case had testified with heartbreaking clarity about Crawford's threats and Marcus's protection. Her words, spoken in a courtroom filled with federal officials and newspaper reporters, had transformed public perception of the man who had been branded a dangerous killer. The courage of a 7-year-old girl had accomplished what legal arguments and character witnesses had failed to achieve. But the most stunning revelation had come when investigators had discovered that Marcus himself was a federal agent, working deep undercover to expose corruption within law enforcement agencies. The badge hidden among his possessions had been authentic, his assignment legitimate, his actions authorized by authorities who had since been desperately trying to locate their missing operative. The man accused of murdering a federal marshal had actually been eliminating a corrupt official who threatened an ongoing investigation. The vindication had been complete and public, reported in newspapers across 3 states, and resulting in commendations for courage that officially recognized his years of dangerous work protecting the vulnerable. But Marcus had seemed less interested in public recognition than in the simple freedom to build a life with the woman who had risked everything to stand beside him during his darkest hour. The proposal had come during a quiet evening as they worked together in the inn's kitchen, his voice carrying the gentle uncertainty of someone who had spent so many years protecting others that he had almost forgotten how to accept protection in return. The ring he offered had been crafted from silver he had somehow acquired during his travels, its surface engraved with tiny horses that reminded her of his wooden carvings and the connection that had brought them together. Isabella's acceptance had been immediate and absolute, her heart having already made the commitment that her mind now embraced without reservation. The love that had grown between them was built on foundations of shared trauma and mutual recognition, trust earned through actions rather than words, and the kind of loyalty that could survive separation and legal proceedings, and the simple arithmetic of society's attempts to reduce human worth to convenient categories. The wedding preparations had been modest but joyful, attended by the few neighbors who had come to understand that Marcus represented protection rather than threat. Sheriff Bennett had offered to perform the ceremony, his own understanding of justice having been transformed by witnessing how completely wrong official reports could be about someone whose character had been shaped by service rather than self-interest. Marshal Hayes had traveled from Pittsburgh specifically to attend the wedding, bringing with him official documents that cleared Marcus's name completely and restored his federal authority should he choose to resume active duty. But Marcus had made clear that his wandering days were over, that he had found something worth staying still for, someone whose welfare mattered more than the abstract justice that had driven his solitary crusade. The inn had been transformed not just by Marcus's skilled labor, but by the hope that their partnership had restored to a property that had seemed destined for failure. The guest registry now showed regular bookings from travelers who appreciated clean accommodations, managed by people whose commitment to hospitality was matched by their ability to provide genuine security for those who required refuge from various forms of pursuit or persecution. Isabella moved through the familiar rooms that had been her prison and were now her palace, touching surfaces that gleamed with care and attention that transformed functional spaces into expressions of love made manifest through patient work. The kitchen where she had discovered Marcus's true identity now hosted conversations that filled evening hours with the comfortable companionship she had almost forgotten was possible between people whose lives had been shaped by loss. The stable that had once housed only her aging mare now sheltered horses that Marcus had somehow acquired through means she did not question, animals whose gentle temperaments made them perfect for the riding lessons he had begun offering to children from neighboring farms. His work with young riders was volunteer service that connected their current life to the protective instincts that had defined his solitary years. The carved horses that had triggered their mutual recognition had been joined by an entire menagerie of wooden animals, each piece crafted during evening hours when conversation gave way to the comfortable silence of people who understood each other well enough that words were often unnecessary. The carvings filled shelves throughout the inn, tokens of artistic expression that transformed practical spaces into galleries celebrating the beauty that could emerge from hands that had known both violence and gentleness. As the afternoon light began its transformation toward the golden tones that would witness their ceremony, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of commitment and celebration. The auction that had seemed like desperate circumstance had been revealed as destiny, the intersection of her need for protection with his need for sanctuary creating possibilities that neither could have achieved alone. The $3 she had spent had purchased not just labor but the return of the most important relationship of her childhood, transformed now into the foundation for a marriage that would be built on complete understanding of each other's character and absolute trust in their shared commitment to protecting what they had built together. The transaction that had begun as simple employment had evolved into something approaching miracle. Marcus appeared in the doorway wearing clothes that transformed his intimidating presence into something approaching elegance, his massive frame somehow made gentle by the formal attire that marked this occasion as different from the working clothes that had defined their daily interactions. The love in his eyes was matched by the wonder that seemed to accompany his realization that someone had chosen to share a life with him despite knowing everything about his past. The ceremony was conducted in the inn's common room, surrounded by the evidence of their joint labor, and witnessed by people who had come to understand that their partnership represented hope for others whose lives had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound, promises to protect and cherish each other through whatever challenges the future might present. When Marcus spoke the words that made Isabella his wife, his voice carried the same gentle strength that had comforted a frightened child in a Pittsburgh stable 20 years earlier. When she promised to stand beside him regardless of what dangers their life together might face, her words carried the absolute certainty of someone whose faith had been tested and proven unbreakable. The celebration that followed was marked by the particular joy that accompanies triumph over circumstances that once seemed insurmountable. Their guests included federal officials who had come to honor a colleague whose service had exceeded every expectation, neighbors who had learned to value protection over fear, and children whose riding lessons had taught them that strength could be gentle and authority could be kind. As evening settled over the property that had become both sanctuary and symbol of their love's power to transform desperate circumstances into abundant joy, Marcus and Isabella stood together watching the sunset paint their world in shades of gold that promised endless tomorrows filled with the kind of happiness that comes from building something meaningful with someone whose character has been tested by the worst life can offer and proven worthy of absolute trust. The wooden horse that had triggered their recognition sat on the windowsill where lamplight would soon begin its nightly vigil, no longer a token of memory but a symbol of love that had survived separation and accusation, and the simple mathematics of society's attempts to reduce human relationships to convenient categories. Their story had begun with an act of compassion at a desperate auction, and had culminated in commitment that would endure whatever tests the future might devise. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.